Hi, my name is Eric Paul Dennis. I am an infrastructure policy analyst with the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. I've recently completed a research project on road usage charging and thought it might be helpful to put this presentation together to share what I've learned. It's intended for policymakers considering pursuing road use charging policy, but it may also be of interest for those seeking to learn more about transportation system funding and related emerging policy debates in general. I hope you enjoy it. First, let's talk about what road use charging is. As implied by the name, it is a fee charged for the use of a road, typically assessed by distance traveled. This isn't a standardized term, and in the past it has been called different things. It may still be called different things. For example, a vehicle miles traveled fee or charge, a mileage-based user fee or charge, a mileage fee or charge, or a highway use fee. In the past few years, advocates for this concept have mostly coalesced around calling this road usage charging, or RUC, and so that's the term that I'm going to be using. You may also occasionally hear these concepts referred to as a tax. Sometimes this is for legal reasons, sometimes it's just kind of random, but in terms of strict economic definitions, this is more appropriately described as a use fee or use charge. But essentially, all of these concepts assess a charge for the use of a road related to the distance traveled on that road. This may sound familiar. Tolling. Tolling is an example of a road use charge, but conventionally, when we use the term road use charge or RUC, we are referring to something slightly different. So what's the difference between tolling and RUC? Well, it's a little bit complicated. It's not always entirely clear, and it's becoming less clear. Part of the reason is historical. We've had travel tolls for time immemorial. For most of history, travelers would stop at a toll booth, pay the toll for the right to use the road or bridge or other facility, and then proceed on their trip. However, in recent decades, new technology has given us the option of removing toll booths and applying the tolls electronically, such as through radio transponders like your EasyPass widget or automated license plate recognition. Yet this is still considered tolling. It has typically been the historical tolling authorities adopting the booth-free electronic methods, simply paying the same toll in a more efficient way. Very similar technologies, maybe identical technologies, could be used to apply a road usage charge. So the main difference is that a toll is applied to a single facility, one road or one bridge, or maybe a tunnel, ferry, whatever. RUC is applied to an entire road network. The user would be paying a per mile fee, regardless of which road on that network they are driving on. Well, usually, but not always. There are variations of RUC that might apply a fee only to certain roads. It might also apply only to certain vehicles, perhaps only at certain times of day. So it can get complicated, and there's a blurry distinction between all electronic tolling and some conceptual implementations of RUC. I think it's possible, maybe even likely, that in future decades these concepts will become integrated and indistinguishable. After all, if we had a mature functioning RUC program, separate tolling authorities would seem redundant. I actually brought this up recently in a conversation with a tolling industry consultant. I asked, hypothetically, if we had a national mature RUC program, wouldn't tolling be redundant? And his answer was, quote, you will always need enforcement, which is true, but doesn't quite answer my question. There could be enforcement in many different ways, not necessarily through a tolling authority. Currently in the United States, RUC programs are very small and not a threat to the tolling industry. In fact, they see this as an opportunity to expand. But in my opinion, RUC is a threat to the tolling industry, and this is a well-established industry with lobbying power, so it's worth considering the implications of that from a policy and economic standpoint. This dynamic might cause some conflicts down the road. Policymakers should keep this in mind as they pursue these programs, whether in cooperation with or separate from existing tolling authorities. Okay, so why are we suddenly learning about these things? If you're watching this video, you're probably already somewhat familiar with the issue. I'm showing here a graphic from RUC America, which is an industry organization acting as something of a convener of RUC interests and information. And this is how they dumb it down. But essentially, the United States has relied on fuel taxes for many decades to fund road construction and maintenance. There are other revenue sources, but fuel taxes are the majority of dedicated transportation funding, and this is becoming an issue. Fuel tax revenue is not keeping up with road funding needs. One problem is that the federal gas tax, states are different, but the federal gas tax has not been increased since 1993, and it was not indexed to inflation. So the fuel tax revenues that the federal government is getting, which funds a lot of our programs on a per gallon basis, now have less than half the purchasing power as they did in 1993 when they were last raised. Additionally, a typical new vehicle is more fuel efficient than ever before. Here's a chart from the EPA. In 1993, a typical new vehicle was getting about 21 miles per gallon. In 2023, we're somewhere around 26 miles per gallon. This chart overstates the impact a bit because the typical vehicle on the road is not a 2023 model, but is in fact about 10 or 11 years old. However, we can expect this general trend to continue, especially with the increasing percentage of electric vehicles in the fleet, which don't pay any fuel tax at all. It's also worth mentioning that heavy commercial vehicles are substantial contributors to fuel tax revenue, and the fuel economy of heavy trucks has been much more stable than this, and so the related revenue has been much more dependable and forecastable. Regardless, overall, I think we can adopt the assumption that fuel taxes have become less sufficient as a funding mechanism, and that trend will continue. So states and the Federal Highway Administration are exploring ways to replace or augment fuel tax revenues. So now I'm going to provide a very brief and selective history of some RUC programs. I'm not even entirely sure if this is relevant, but I learned about it, so I'm going to tell you about it. And this isn't completely straightforward either because, as I mentioned, RUC isn't a very well-defined term, and other nomenclatures are often used and continue to be used. Additionally, the non-US programs tend to have quite a different approach and policy goals than the programs that are now being explored in the US. But anyway, I'll lay this out as best as I can think of how to do it from the research that I conducted and how I came to understand it. As far as I can tell, the earliest example of a RUC charge, distinct from tolling, was implemented in New Zealand. There is a historical reason for this. Back in the mid-20th century, New Zealand had very few diesel-powered on-road vehicles. Most of the use of diesel in New Zealand at that time was for agricultural or construction equipment. So while New Zealand implemented a fuel tax on gasoline to create road funding revenue, any diesel vehicles were not contributing. So in 1978, a mileage fee was imposed on heavy commercial vehicles to capture the damage that they did to the roads. Over time, and probably in response to being exempted from fuel taxes, New Zealanders increasingly adopted light-duty diesel vehicles, passenger cars, and small trucks. So at some point, New Zealand implemented a mileage fee on light diesel vehicles, and it now applies to all electric vehicles as well. As far as I know, New Zealand is the only nation in the world where drivers of light vehicles, passenger vehicles, pay a mandatory fee on all roads. This is pretty unique. Drivers there are required to report the miles they drove to the government and pay the associated fee. It's worth noting that this fee, paying this fee, is largely based on the honor system. There's really no enforcement as far as I can tell, but it seems that compliance is high regardless. When we move into Europe, things become a little bit complicated because there are no programs, as far as I can tell, that assess all vehicles on all road and can be considered RUC. It tends to be applied to heavy commercial vehicles on all roads or light vehicles on certain roads. So the distinction between electronic tolling and RUC is really being confused here. I'm including these in this talk about RUC largely because they were assessed in an exploratory 2012 study on road usage charging published by the US Government Accountability Office. I found this report from 2012 to be a very useful resource, and that's where I learned about these things. They talked about them. So the government considers it relevant, and I consider it relevant, even though it's really not the flavor of RUC that we're probably talking about in 2023. Also in Europe, there are countries like Norway and Sweden that have a very expansive toll road network. This is not all roads, but my understanding is that it would be nearly impossible to travel without frequently using the toll road network. So there is a practical mandate for light vehicles to participate in the tolling program and pay these usage fees. So again, this is sort of blurring that distinction between tolling and road usage charging. These countries also have additional charges for heavy commercial vehicles. My takeaway from all this is that it's actually quite rare to have a mandatory use fee on light vehicles for all roads. Only New Zealand does it, only on non-gasoline vehicles, and those crazy friendly Kiwis don't find a need to have much of an enforcement mechanism because they see high compliance even with an honor-based system. This is important because enforcement imposes significant administrative costs, which can become substantial. Here in the States, we've been thinking about this for a while, even if we didn't do much about it. I'm going to highlight a few resources that helped me understand the history of RUC policy approaches in the US. This is not exhaustive, but I think these are the main ones. Starting with a 1998 highway cost allocation study. This is a really good study, probably in need of updating, but essentially the US DOT estimated which vehicle classes were overpaying or underpaying for the cost imposed to the transportation system and by how much. Importantly, this did not factor in externalities such as air pollution, noise pollution, safety, etc. But the study does talk about that, but it's not included in the cost allocations. Their summary findings are represented in this table here. So starting at the top with automobiles, FHWA found that automobile users in the United States were underpaying by a bit over $300 million. Note that this is not the cost associated with pavement damage. This is the cost of building additional capacity to accommodate growing VMT, so new lanes, highway widening, additional capacity. Other light vehicles, pickup trucks and vans, were found to be overpaying into the system by kind of a lot, 1.6 billion. And this is because those vehicles were less fuel efficient and so were paying more per mile in fuel taxes, but at that time were only a small component of the VMT demand that imposes capacity expansion. When we move down this chart, we get into commercial vehicle classes, and nearly all of them were found to be underpaying. There are some exceptions. Some weight and axle load combinations were underpaying by a bit, But generally, it was found that heavy vehicles, commercial trucks, were not paying their fair share of highway costs. And in response to this, the study concluded that an additional weight distance-based tax or fee on heavy vehicles would be a more efficient and equitable way to fund the highway system. And this wasn't new. There was a US DOT study in the early 80s related to the last time the department conducted a highway cost assessment. At that time as well, the department emphasized that heavy trucks were drastically underpaying into the system and suggested a weight mileage tax to make up the difference. They also alternatively suggested that diesel fuel could be taxed. There would be a way to tax diesel fuel so that heavy trucks would be paying more per gallon than lighter vehicles, but the weight mileage tax was emphasized at that point as well. So the idea of road use charging isn't new in the US. It was previously considered similar to overseas as a way to get heavy vehicles to pay for the damage they imposed on the system, but it's not a new idea. But they were focused on heavy vehicles, at least until 2005. At that time, the Federal Highways Program Reauthorization Bill, SAFETY-LU, created a commission to consider alternatives to create revenue for the Highway Trust Fund, and that commission created a report. There are a lot of different ideas in this report, but one of the ideas that was emphasized, maybe the most emphasized idea, was implementing a federal funding system based on a VMT fee that would eventually replace fuel tax revenue. They envisioned this as a federally led program that states would be able to kind of piggyback off of to fund state and local systems, and they envisioned this system as being fully implemented by the year 2020. While that didn't happen, this was a relatively influential policy document, and it seeded further efforts and federal funding in future bills. Subsequent to this work, or actually maybe at the same time as this work, the FHWA made some grant money and guidance available for states to begin researching their own RUC programs, and a few states started doing so. So there are now quite a bit reports, usually federal subsidized reports, exploring RUC charges dating back to about this time. So at this point, most US states, a slim majority probably, maybe a strong majority, have studied or are in the process of exploring how road usage charges could be implemented to create transportation revenue. This chart here, or this map here, is from the FHWA, showing recipients of federal grants specifically from the Surface Transportation Systems Funding Alternative Program. And actually it's a bit out of date because at least Michigan should be rendered here, but that wasn't on the website yet as of yesterday. Also, this wasn't the only funding source, so there's been a lot of research, and there are dozens of publications on road usage charging from the last decade or so. I'm actually going to focus on the 3 states that have actually institutionalized a RUC program such that it is contributing revenue to their state transportation fund. Beginning with Oregon. Oregon started pursuing RUC policy in earnest back in, I think, around 2001. They did a bunch of thinking, a bunch of studies, and a couple pilot programs, and finally went live with it in there was enabling legislation in 2013. The program went live in 2015. They call it Origo. So Origo has now been operating fully institutionalized for over a decade. It is a voluntary program available to most light vehicles so long as the estimated combined fuel efficiency is better than 20 miles per gallon. Electric vehicle and hybrid drivers who opt into the program are exempted from their registration fee. For electric vehicle drivers, participants will save money if they, by opting out of that fee and opting into this program, if they drive less than about 6,300 miles per year. I'm not sure what the math would work out for hybrid or very high efficiency ICE vehicle drivers. It obviously depends on the vehicle. I think they would also be eligible for the fuel tax rebate. I'm not sure about that. It seems complicated, and it is complicated. There was actually a state audit in Oregon that found a high error rate led to incorrect fees being applied through this program to about 1 in 4 participants. But they're learning and they're working through these issues, and there is legislation pending over there to further evolve this program and transition it into a mandate. It's a really well-funded, really well thought out approach. They've created a lot of knowledge to draw from. Next up is Utah. Utah also had an extensive history of researching RUC dating back to the early 2000s, and finally in 2019 passed legislation to institutionalize a program. Again, this is voluntary. They've gone through a couple of iterations. It is now eligible only for full battery electric vehicles who, by enrolling in the program, are exempt from a $130 annual registration fee. And so, if you're in this program, your RUC charge is capped at that fee. So you will never pay more than if you did not opt into the program. At 1 cent per mile, if you drive your electric vehicle less than about 13,000 miles per year, you will be saving with this program. The most recent addition is Virginia, who really had no prior experience with RUC studies or pilots as far as I can find. They just kind of jumped in last year. This is also a voluntary program, but quite a bit more popular than Utah or Oregon. They've had more success in recruiting participants. It's available to any internal combustion engine vehicle it's available to any vehicle, including internal combustion vehicles, that are subject to the state's highway use fee, which is applied to fuel efficient vehicles, alternative fuel vehicles, and electric vehicles. So Virginia is kind of interesting. They don't apply a flat mileage fee. They exempt enrollees from their highway use fee and then divide that number by 11,600 miles, which is the average distance traveled by vehicles in that state, apparently. So if you are eligible and you enroll in that program and you drive less than 11,600 miles in a year, you will be saving money. And it's capped at that cost, so you will never need to pay more than the non-opt-in standard program. In Virginia, enrolling in this program will almost definitely benefit you and not hurt you, except for, the maybe hours so that you spend on thinking about it or whatever. So anyway, there have been many pilots and many studies in the United States, but only these 3 states have institutionalized a RUC program that is actually sending revenue to their transportation fund. So I think it should be emphasized that these 3 programs are revenue negative. They are costing the states more than if they didn't exist. With Utah and Virginia, that's obvious. The user fee is capped at the non-opt-in alternative registration fee, so those volunteers cannot possibly pay more and will likely pay less than if they, for having opted into the system. So that's less revenue going into their system. Oregon is a bit more complicated because under their program, it is possible for a user to pay more than the baseline alternative, but that's probably why they have a 10-year program with only about 1,000 enrollees. And the administrative costs there are substantial. They've created a whole program office to support this with full-time staff. So rough numbers here, this is kind of conservative, but they have, the number that I was able to find was 800. 800 enrollees, but let's say it's 1,000. Let's say those 1,000 users are all electric vehicle drivers. I believe the registration fee they are exempted from is about $350. Let's assume they're paying that in RUC fees, even though it's definitely less. That's $350,000 in revenue per year that they're getting from that program. That's definitely costing millions of dollars a year to administer. It's kind of a big, like, they have a whole website and full-time staff and studies and everything, and they are getting some support from the federal government, but remember, they would have gotten that revenue for the registration fee, the non-opt-in option registration fee, without that program. So anyone engaged in an institutionalized RUC program in the United States right now is losing money, even though they are being subsidized through federal grant programs. And that's, by the way, I want to point that out because I want states' policymakers to know that this is not an easy go-to solution to derive revenue. But I want to emphasize that I'm not negging on the states that are doing this and losing money, because these are pilot programs that we're learning from, and actually we're all benefiting from this. I'm benefiting from the money that they're spending on this. But it's important for policymakers to understand that no one is deriving revenue from RUC in the United States right now. They're working on it. They might have a path to get there. It's not clear to me that they do, but RUC is not a revenue solution in the near term without some, I don't know, more thinking. This is why we have pilot programs. We just don't know yet. And let me introduce a caveat. There are at least 6 states in the United States that have a mileage-based system in place that is creating revenue. Connecticut, Kentucky, Oregon, New Mexico, and New York. These states have implemented weight mileage fees on heavy vehicles. So why don't we hear about these states when we talk about RUC? I don't know, but I have a guess. I think to understand why these don't come up in RUC conversations, you have to understand something about interest groups. There is an emerging RUC industry made up of consulting firms and platform providers that are selling services to take advantage of grant money available and perhaps a cut of the revenue coming from these programs, probably also trying to leverage the data that they're getting from these programs to sell tertiary services. It's an industry, and the RUC industry probably doesn't brag about these states with weight distance fees because no one's making money from it. They didn't spend a bunch of research grant money on consultants or contract with a platform provider. I think it's interesting that the RUC industry will mention very similar programs to these that are being done overseas. The main difference, as far as I can tell, is that the overseas programs are using publicly funded technology platforms to receive the weight mileage data. These states, they just imposed a fee and passed the administrative burden onto the trucking companies to figure out how to report it. Since this is being done through tax policy, if the trucking companies try some non-compliant hanky-panky, they risk getting audited, which I'm sure the trucking companies absolutely hate. And look, I'm certain it's not a non-negligible reporting burden for them, but we only have so many options, and the trucking companies impose the lion's share of pavement damage to the roads. So I'm not advocating for this avenue of road usage charging by imposing mileage weight taxes or fees on heavy vehicles through tax policy. I just learned that it existed only recently, but my intuition is that it's pretty clever and it seems to be working. But I wanted to acknowledge that Well, it's not RUC, like jazz hands RUC. It is an option to efficiently and equitably increase transportation funding that policymakers should be aware of. So now I'm going to admit a bias. I believe that some kind of RUC policy, even applied to light vehicles, is the best long-term approach to create dedicated transportation revenue as fuel taxes become less useful. I don't know if it's a great approach. Again, options are limited, but I'm happy there is active research here. But I'm also afraid that resources are likely to be squandered if policymakers are not informed and strategic about how they go about policy design. So I would like to offer something of a structured approach to designing a RUC policy that takes advantage of the work that has come before and moves us forward towards implementable, scaled up policy, or otherwise determines that this isn't the solution that we're looking for so that resources can be targeted more wisely. I think that an initial step in crafting any policy should be to identify your policy goals. A mature RUC program would be a key element of broader transportation and fiscal policies, and so those pre-existing policy goals should be considered in your RUC program design. Safety, efficiency, equity, mobility, whatever your broader priorities are, you want to make sure that your RUC program is complementing those. This might seem obvious, but this step is often overlooked or at least not given the attention that it deserves. In the case of RUC, if you're a state that simply wants to learn more about it, honestly, probably don't need to fund a study. Extensive resources are available. Studies have been conducted, reports have been published, lots of people you can ask. Talk to Origo for an hour and you'll save yourself several $100,000 in consulting fees. They would be happy to lobby you on the benefits of RUC, I'm sure. And I think they would even be fairly forthcoming with the lessons learned and sticking points, the problems that they're having that they've discovered through their learning process, especially if you ask the right questions. If you do move forward with the study, be very careful about how you word RFPs and select consultants. Road usage charging, RUC, is kind of near the top of the hype cycle right now, and there are some maybe unjustified expectations that have transmogrified into conventional wisdom. So you want to make sure that you're learning things that are real and not learning things that people wish were real. Of course, much can be learned through hands-on experience, and states may want to emphasize gaining that experience by initiating a pilot program. That's cool, just think of what you would be looking to accomplish with the pilot and make sure it is structured to accomplish your objectives. The ultimate goal of RUC is to create revenue, net positive revenue. As we've already discussed, no one is doing this yet, not with light vehicles, with the exception of New Zealand. This is not a good panic move to try to fill revenue gaps. You should also understand that voluntary opt-in programs may work much differently than scaled-up mandated programs for a variety of reasons, some of which we'll cover in a bit. But think about scalability in the initial pilot design so that you don't have to scrap everything and start over when you want to start pulling meaningful funding from the program. In my opinion, the most interesting potential of RUC is what can be done with the platform while you are deriving revenue. If structured appropriately, there could be an interesting potential to expand RUC beyond simple revenue generation to transportation system management. Things like congestion mitigation, perhaps influencing system user behavior in other ways. But as a general summary, think about why you're pursuing RUC policy and tailor your program design to best achieve those policy goals. Next item, what vehicles will be eligible for your program? This isn't as easy of a question as it might sound like. The couple of RUC programs that have been institutionalized for over a year, Oregon and Utah, have both modified the vehicle eligibility requirements. In Utah, they imposed restrictions so that currently only battery electric vehicles are eligible. In Oregon, they've gone through a few iterations. I think they might have tightened up vehicle eligibility in a couple of ways, but generally they've been expanding it to include more vehicles in your program. I would start here by thinking about your policy goals and what vehicles would need to be included in your program to address those policy goals. But also consider trade-offs in administrative complexity and costs. The more types of vehicles that you include within your program, the more complicated your program might need to be to accommodate them. You probably won't want any broad or certainly universal eligibility under a pilot program. But when you're designing a pilot program, it's worth thinking about how you intend to evolve that, perhaps to a mandate in the long term, under which I would assume there would be universal applicability. But in the initial steps, it might be a good idea to keep it simple. In the United States, no one is really talking about applying RUC to heavy commercial vehicles, or I guess more specifically, as we discussed, when this has been done, it's usually not thought of as RUC. It's usually called a weight mileage tax, but those are just words. Start with your policy objectives and go from there. Once you determine which vehicles are eligible for your program, you're still not done because you need to determine a fee structure. This could be easy. Oregon and Utah have made it easy by applying a flat fee to all eligible vehicles on all roads at all times. If your only objective is to supplement or replace gas tax revenue, this approach might make sense. But your fee structure is going to impose incentives and disincentives whether you want it to or not. So think about what those are and if they support or negate your other policy goals. Minnesota, for example, is currently evaluating a RUC fee model that would relate their mileage fee to the vehicle class. So like one for compact cars, one for full-size cars, SUVs, trucks, vans, things like that. I don't recall the details, but the idea is to collect usage charging commensurate with what that vehicle would have paid or would pay in equivalent fuel taxes. And this is somewhat related to vehicle weight. But I want to stop there and address something because I've heard more than once, sometimes from reputable consultants and public agents, that higher fees should be applied to electric vehicles because they are heavier than their internal combustion counterparts, and since they're heavier, apply more damage to the roads. They are heavier, and technically they do impose more load onto the pavement. However, that does not really translate into more damage. Okay, say an electric vehicle is 20% heavier than its alternative. 120% times zero is still zero. Light-duty vehicles do not cause measurable pavement damage, okay? I've decided to restrict myself from giving a tutorial on pavement cross-section design, but when you design a pavement, you care mostly about truckload. The other factors are climate, perhaps geology, but light vehicles, your light vehicle traffic, passenger vehicles, that's just a rounding error. Pavement engineers don't care what your light vehicle loading is. If there's any possibility that a single truck is going to be driving down your road in the lifetime of that road, you need to design to that. And that design will be robust enough that the pavement can barely even feel a measly F350. So if you're telling EV drivers that they need to pay more to pay their fair share of pavement damage, you are telling them an untruth. And it's probably not a solid foundation for a policy where you will be taking their money. So I just want to address that now because it's something that's been bothering me lately. Let's move on. Another option might be vehicle footprint, the space that the vehicle takes up on the road. This data is available because our federal efficiency requirements are footprint-based. And I think there's a good argument that larger vehicles do impose greater system costs regardless of weight by, taking up more space. Perhaps you would want to tie this to the vehicle age and value for some reason. I'm not sure why, but some states apply registration fees that way. I'm assuming it's an attempt to be anti-regressive, so that might be a consideration in your RUC charge. Under some conceptualizations of RUC, you could use it basically for congestion charging, similar to time variable tolling, and that's probably like advanced level stuff, but that's also an important attribute for why RUC might be useful as a policy tool, so that's something worth thinking about. And at this point, it's getting kind of wild. I was just listing things, but it could also be possible to charge drivers for, like, I don't know, antisocial behavior. So like under the fuel tax, when you speed, your vehicle is operating less efficiently and you're paying more into the system. And speed has externalities regarding safety, risk, and noise pollution. So you might consider that a mile traveled over the speed limit should be charged higher than a mile traveled under. I don't know. I'm not sure if I would even advocate that, but it's an interesting possibility. Just things that you might consider when you're thinking about how you might structure your RUC fees. When you're starting out, you probably want to start simple, but if you have ambitions to transition to this program into a large scale or mandate program, you will want to make sure that your system is architected to incorporate the data that would allow you to make that happen. RUC implementation is not a technology problem, but there are technology options, including very minimal technology. Some of the pilot programs just have people submit their mileage along with a photo of their dashboard. If you're a state with annual inspections, it could be built into that process. But if we want to scale up and eventually mandate these programs, I think we're probably talking about getting data off the vehicle through some kind of wireless connectivity. The GPS-enabled OBD dongle seems to be the go-to approach, but that's kind of expensive. There are some potential technology snafus, and there's also competition for that port. I'm not sure if that's a long-term scalable solution. Ideally, we'd like to be getting this information from the vehicle embedded systems. When you start thinking in this direction, we need to think about how the automotive industry works. You've got a dozen or so automakers with different technology standards and approaches to data management. Most of them also have designs on monetizing that data and would be looking to take their cut of revenue. So this could become a very intimidating problem. I don't see an obvious path forward here, but people are working on it. There are other connected vehicle systems such as dedicated short-range communication and cellular V2X. Nobody is using these for RUC as far as I know. It could be possible to build a RUC platform off these technologies, probably not optimal. But I bring it up here now mainly for the reason that I've seen multiple presentations on road usage charging where the presenter will be talking about developing a connected vehicle ecosystem around RUC, and an audience member will ask a question, or, it's not so much a question as a comment, relating the investments that their jurisdiction has made in a connected vehicle ecosystem using DSRC or C-V2X. When I've seen this happen, the conversation then proceeds as though they're talking about the same thing, and they're absolutely not. So understand that the term connected vehicle or connected vehicle ecosystem can mean many different things. These systems are not directly interoperable or even obviously related to each other. So policy designers should probably understand something about the technologies and communication standards that they're dealing with before assuming too much about what might be achievable through those varying technologies. Now that's What I talked about before, that's just about how to get data off the vehicle, but there are also questions about what that data looks like that should be considered. There are different ways you can structure your data, different platform options you should probably at least be aware of before you're drafting RFPs or awarding contracts. But there's some pretty good advice there's some consultants that know what they're doing, and lessons learned in Oregon and elsewhere could give you good guidance on that point. User responsibilities. If we transition to a RUC-based system, we will be asking drivers to do something more, or at least something different than they are accustomed to. This is important to think about because user dissatisfaction may translate into political backlash and kill your program. The fuel tax system set a really high bar for frictionless payment. Current RUC programs are, I think, being fairly reasonable in what is being asked of users, but again, these are, in the US, opt-in voluntary programs. And this is one of those things that might look quite a bit different at scale or as a mandate. We should be very careful about designing programs that would inconvenience or even be perceived as an inconvenience to users. Privacy and data security. There are ways to architect a RUC program to practically negate privacy issues, basically by limiting the data that leaves the vehicle and further limiting the data that leaves the private sector platform provider. But once you do that, you're foregoing some potential benefits of RUC, so you need to think about those trade-offs. I think that the pilot programs are handling this well. Oregon in particular has addressed this very thoroughly. But this is another one of those things that might become harder as programs evolve from small voluntary pilots to full-scale programs or mandates. This could also be an evolving issue. In the United States, privacy rights have been read into the Fourth Amendment, but those are based on reasonable expectations of privacy, and the expectation of a reasonable person may change over time as determined by the courts. Additionally, digital privacy and data rights more broadly are an area of active policy. RUC policy designers should be aware of how their programs might interact with existing and potential privacy legislation, both at the state and federal level. Now, I often deal with issues where agencies or corporations are hesitant to share data because of privacy or cybersecurity issues, and I'm sensitive to their concerns. But I like to pose a question to try to suss out how legitimate their concerns are. And my question is, what is your threat model? What specifically are you concerned about is going to happen if you share this data? So to turn that back on me, to validate my belief that this is a valid concern, I'm going to propose a couple of threat models to support the idea that this is a legitimate issue that cannot just be waved aside, which, to be honest, I've seen some RUC interests do. First, understand that you cannot assume that the political and socioeconomic context in which your program is designed will be the political and socioeconomic context in which it will live. In our system in the United States, when one government agency has data, it is typically pretty easy for law enforcement agencies to get that data. And our location data can tell a law enforcement agency a lot about what we've been up to. And even if we believe that our activities are legal and justifiable, they might not always agree. It is not impossible that law enforcement agencies in the future could begin to target activities that many of us consider rights. You might be aware that on January 6, 2021, the United States Capitol was occupied by supporters of the former president, many of them armed. No matter your political stripes, you probably think one or two things about this. Either the United States came dangerously close to having a democratic election nullified by violence, or you believe that a democratic election was overturned and the rightful president was usurped. In either case, this makes the point that the government we have is not always the government we want. And it would not be unusual for federal law or state, any law enforcement agencies to target citizens that the prevailing administration considers politically dangerous. In fact, that's in the federal case, that's kind of part of their job. So let's get a little bit more specific. There are elected officials who would like to prevent interstate travel for reproductive health services, and there are probably public prosecutors who would happily do so. I don't think this is likely, but it's possible. Maybe you're of a political bent where this doesn't bother you, but if so, this might. What if your travel behavior was used to determine if you are buying guns in other states where gun control legislation is not so strict? Again, I don't think this is likely, but it is possible. You know, interstate travel is not an enumerated right. I mean, we have the Commerce Clause, but that applies to commerce, not plain old bodies crossing state lines. There's no right to travel in the Constitution, believe it or not. This is mostly about data privacy, but cybersecurity related issues, vehicle theft could also be a concern, especially if it's one of these programs where you're plugging a dongle into the CAN bus and maybe connecting to it through Bluetooth or something. I don't know how these systems are architected, but I'm going to go ahead and guess that they were not architected with security strictly in mind. I mean, they will say they are, but I would bet that an intelligent person could probably break them. So cybersecurity for vehicle theft is a concern too, as well as these privacy issues. So okay, let me take off my tinfoil hat and say this. I think these issues are manageable with known practices in data management and cybersecurity. I don't think that these concerns should prevent the development of a robust RUC system. But they are valid concerns. Don't just wave them aside. And for the love of God, don't say something like, well, everybody tweets out their location all the time anyhow. We all have smartphones. Like, okay, so please don't do this. First of all, what? Just because everybody is sharing the location data all the time doesn't mean it's a healthy thing to do. If I have 3 cheeseburgers and a beer for dinner, that doesn't mean it's cool for me to have a half gallon of ice cream and a pint of bourbon for dessert. Second, there's a big difference between a corporation having my data and a government entity having my data. Mainly, it is much less likely that a law enforcement agency would be able to access that data without a subpoena or a warrant if it's held in a company cloud as opposed to a government server. So let me summarize by saying this. Any system that mandates reporting of location data to a government entity or its proxy is a big deal. These are real concerns, and you will not engender trust by dismissing them. Socioeconomic implications. If the intent is to scale or mandate RUC at some point, it is worth thinking about the consequences of changing how people pay for the right to drive. The United States is a country where, in most places, you practically need to drive a car to fully participate in the economy and society. It's also a country where an awful lot of people are living on the edge, economically speaking, putting gas in their car with cash, $20 at a time when they have it. If you impose barriers to driving or allow debts to accrue that people may not be prepared for, you could impact how the whole economy functions and make life more difficult for individuals and families. I think it's really important to think this through and try to avoid unintended consequences. These issues are often framed by terms like equity or social justice or environmental justice. I think it's a good thing that we're paying more attention to these issues. However, sometimes I get the feeling that these frameworks are largely a response to past mistakes and injustices and are blind to new problems that we might be creating. Plus, let's be honest, there are many people who get their hackles up when they hear these terms. I found it much more useful to group these concepts into a broader socioeconomic dimensions of a systems analytical approach to policy analysis and evaluate potential policy impacts from that perspective. And these impacts can be linked to various available statistics, sometimes with reasonably clear causal relationships. And listen, even if you're not concerned about people, think of the economy. Many of these people living paycheck to paycheck are the foundation of our economy. Unless and until we completely re-engineer the transportation system, they need to be able to drive. So consider that. I've presented these topics in a sequence, but I want to establish that addressing them cannot be sequential and must be holistic. One exception, I do think that identifying policy goals needs to come first. But after that, you get into the messy details. Any decisions made on any one of these items will likely impact the other items, so you're going to have to design a RUC policy iteratively, revisiting details as you finalize the approach to make sure that all the elements fit together coherently. So don't think of these items as a checklist, but as components of a system solution that must be solved iteratively. This is my very last point. My intuition is that for a variety of reasons, a successful RUC program will need to be national policy. The Federal Highway Administration has initiated a nationwide RUC pilot. The conventional wisdom seems to be that the various state pilots and programs are complementary to the federal effort, but I'm not sure about this. My concern is that if states go too far with these programs, they'll establish bureaucracies and local interest groups, perhaps national interest groups, that will resist future reforms that would otherwise make the system better. And there's precedent for this. For example, the United States has a federal mandate for a nationwide interoperable tolling system. The United States does not have a nationwide interoperable tolling system. By the time the mandate came along, there was just too much inertia to the current system, and the system fought back. Existing state and regional programs were too entrenched against this reform that I believe would improve the functioning of the national highway system. So in the case of RUC, as states, and especially the Federal Highway Administration, continue to develop policy, I would just advise everyone to be aware of this possible future conflict and work to try to avoid it. If you're still with me, thank you for your attention. This presentation was provided for informational purpose only. It was a good faith interpretation of available data and information based on my research. If anyone has reason to believe that I have erred in any way, please provide feedback in the comments or feel free to contact me directly. I will do my best to update the presentation to provide the most accurate information. Thank you.